Hello, welcome to How to Read W.G. Zabald's The Immigrants. The Immigrants is the final novel that you'll be reading for this particular summer session course. There'll be a short story and a movie to watch next week, but this is your last major text, which is good news for some of you, I imagine. Um, so, to introduce The Immigrants, I did want to give you some guidelines, some tips for how you might envision attacking the novel, reading it, so that it makes a bit more sense, because this is another unusual type of narrative, something that you might not have seen before. But in introducing Zabald and his novel, I actually want to tell you a story about a different author who does appear as a character in The Immigrants, and that's Vladimir Nabokov. Vladimir Nabokov was a Russian author. Some of you may have read him before. His most famous work is Lolita, the novel Lolita. He was born in Russia, and then he emigrated to France, and then he emigrated to the United States, where he lived the remainder of his life, teaching at Cornell and writing novels. But the thing I want to talk about in terms of Nabokov today is that he was a huge butterfly fanatic. Loved butterflies, collected butterflies, studied butterflies. And during the 50s, he and his wife Vera took a road trip across the country, collecting butterflies, and I think he was writing Lolita, though I'm not 100% sure on that. They took this cross country trip together, stopping at national parks and that sort of thing. And there's a story about that trip, which goes that Nabokov loved butterflies so much that when Vera was driving the car through parks and through places that might be heavily populated with butterflies, Nabokov would actually make her drive the car very slowly, like 15, 20 miles an hour. The reason that he did this, of course, was because he didn't want Vera driving fast enough so that the car would cross paths with a butterfly trying to cross the road and would end up on the windshield, right? So this is something of an apocryphal story. It might not be true, but the point of the story for me, it serves as a kind of metaphor because of this importance of going down one path and crossing, right, with the butterflies. The cars would cross with the butterflies. In other words, we're not talking about a linear trajectory. The car is moving in one direction down the road, but it's also cognizant of the possible differing paths and intersections and coincidences that can occur while you're going down that road. And that's the reason why I wanted to tell that story before you start The Immigrants, because that's essentially how The Immigrants functions. We've seen from our other texts that oftentimes when authors are writing about memory, they don't use linear narrative, right? They try to match the structure of memory by altering the genre or the structure of their works. So again, we saw this with Camus' The Fall, how it was that bullseye shaped, right, with the central moment right in the center. And then the same thing with Ceylon's poem, Todesfuge, the Death Fugue, right, which doesn't really work on a very standard, it's a poem anyway, but it obscures its meaning as much as possible. And now you're seeing it again with The Immigrants. We also saw it with the short story, Jeffrey Sonnabend's Oblissons, because that was a thing. That was a piece which messed with genre by creating a false scientific article, a pseudo-scientific article, so that you believed what Sonnabend was putting forward was an actual theory or an actual fact, and then it turned into a metaphor for memory through a short story rather than some academic or scientific article. And so Sebald's novel, The Immigrants, does something similar, except for me, the way that it works, you get the four stories, right? The four stories of The Immigrants. Each section covers one of those immigrants and tells their story. But the strange, and it doesn't seem to be connected, except that's why the Nabokov story about the butterflies is so important, because what happens is that it doesn't seem to be connected if you think of the novel as a linear narrative, as a narrative that starts at the beginning, goes to the end in a straight line, right? The Immigrants doesn't do that. What it does is tell four different stories, but interwoven through those four stories are a number of coincidences, multiple intersections, multiple paths that collide, figures that collide. And this is part of what Sebald's trying to do in representing memories specifically of the Holocaust, but it doesn't just have to be the Holocaust. But in trying to talk about memory, this is the way that he's chosen to do it. The other thing that he does is that it's really difficult to see The Emigrants as a standard novel at all in terms of genre, because Zabald's work always tended to mix genre. In other words, the novel is part fiction. It's also part documentary. It's also contains photography. There's a lot of biography in there, including autobiography, because the narrator is similar to Sebald, if not the same person. There's travelogue, right? As there's descriptions of places, and then there's also history mixed in with the description of events. So this sort of like docu novel was something that Sebald does really well, and he does it in order to make the representations of memory a bit more authentic for the reader, rather than having like a standard fictional novel. But the focus here, let me tell you a bit about Zabald, just so that you have some kind of background. He's German. He writes in German. Born in 1944, he died in a car accident in 2001. Or actually, he had an aneurysm while he was driving, and that caused the car accident. But he like Nabokov was Russian, lived in France, then he lived in the United States. Zabald was German, but he emigrated to England, and he lived in Manchester for a while. He wrote The Immigrants in 1992. It took about 10 years for a lot of his stuff to be translated into English, but he did most of his writing during the 90s, and it's been translated in the last 10, 15 years. The focus for The Immigrants should be on coincidence. Okay, so for example, just to use Nabokov, I mentioned that Nabokov acts as a character in the novel. He's actually mentioned 7 times throughout. A photograph of Nabokov is included. So this is one of the things you want to think about. Why does Zabald in The Immigrants mention Nabokov 7 times? Why does he feel this connection with Nabokov? Some of it, as we already said, could be because they were both immigrant authors who are living in a kind of adopted homeland. But um, this is the thing that you need to pay attention to, because it's sort of a feeling of deja vu. When I read The Emigrants, I'll have these very strange glimpses or flashes where I feel like I've read that sentence before, or I've met that character before, but I can't remember precisely where. So, what I'd like you to do while you're reading the novel is try to pay attention as much as possible to the coincidences that occur. One of the things that I'm going to do is I've put together a slide which has most of them, I hope all of them, but most of the coincidences listed, so that you can sort of keep track. And the idea here is to think about how the narrator, the not the narrator, but how Zabald creates a narrative of memory through intersection, through not linear narrative, but crisscrossing narrative. And you can see that from the very last page, because as you know, if you when you finish it, you'll find out that it ends with Zabald talking about a photograph of some weavers. He doesn't, strangely, he doesn't give us the photograph. He just describes the photograph, but he's at an old factory and he talks about the weavers, and then he makes an allusion to the 3 fates. In mythology, the 3 fates were the ones who were in control of lifespans, right? They would cut the thread, cut your particular thread when you were destined to die. And that's the illusion that he's making there. But what I'm trying to emphasize is the importance of him ending on the weavers, because this is how he sees it. He sees it as a kind of fabric, as a kind of crisscrossing, coincidental, intersecting fabric. And if you envision it in this manner, it might be easier for you to stick with the novel, to bear with it, because if you're looking for a straight linear narrative plot, it can be confusing. So I hope that that helps a bit. I hope it helps you to understand The Immigrants. Obviously, there's a lot more that we could talk about in there, but I wanted to sort of introduce that structure so that you can see how it works.